Who is C.S. Lewis? Welcome to this biography. C.S. Lewis, a man of faith, imagination, and reason. C.S. Lewis, 1898 to 1963, was a British writer, scholar, and Christian apologist who became one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 20th century. His work spanned many genres, from fiction to philosophy to theology, but what set him apart was his ability to combine intellectual rigor with heartfelt faith, making profound Christian ideas accessible and relatable to a wide audience. Early life and intellectual journey. Lewis was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and as a child, he was raised in a Christian home. However, after the death of his mother when he was just 9 years old, he became deeply disillusioned with God and the world. He later became an atheist during his teenage years, partly because of his sense of loss and suffering, and partly due to intellectual doubts about the existence of God. It wasn't until his 30s that Lewis returned to faith, and this journey of conversion is one of the most compelling aspects of his life story. His conversion to Christianity was not the result of an emotional experience, but rather a gradual process driven by rational thought and personal struggle. He came to believe that Christianity was not only intellectually defensible, but also the most plausible explanation for the existence of good, evil, and the human longing for meaning. This intellectual journey is reflected in many of his writings. The Christian Apologist. While Lewis was an acclaimed academic and a celebrated author of fiction, he became particularly known for his work as a Christian apologist, someone who defends and explains the Christian faith. He argued that Christianity made sense of the world in ways that other worldviews could not, especially in light of human suffering and the quest for meaning. Mere Christianity, 1952, is one of his most famous and widely read books, where he presents the case for Christianity in a simple, logical, and accessible way. The book was based on a series of radio broadcasts Lewis gave during World War II, in which he explained Christian beliefs to a broad audience. He begins with moral arguments, discussing the universal sense of right and wrong, and then builds the case for the Christian God, the nature of Christ, and the transformative power of Christian love. In The Problem of Pain, 1940, Lewis tackled one of the most difficult questions for believers. If God is good, why does suffering exist? His answer combined philosophical reasoning and personal experience, asserting that suffering can be a means of spiritual growth and a necessary part of the human condition. Lewis acknowledged that the problem of pain was a deep mystery, but believed that Christianity offered the most compelling response. Miracles, 1947, is another major work in which Lewis argues that miracles are not a violation of natural law, but are, in fact, a sign that there is something beyond the material world, that there is a divine order. Lewis's work in apologetics is notable for its clarity, depth, and humility. He didn't aim to win arguments, but to help people understand why Christianity is reasonable and offers a coherent explanation for life's deepest questions. Fiction and Christianity. While Lewis is often celebrated for his intellectual contributions to Christian thought, his fiction also played a significant role in communicating his Christian worldview. His most famous fictional work is The Chronicles of Narnia, a 7-book series written for children but deeply imbued with Christian themes. The Narnia books are set in a magical world where animals talk, mythical creatures roam, and the forces of good battle evil. Central to the story is Aslan, a lion who is a clear allegorical representation of Jesus Christ. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, 1950, for example, Aslan sacrifices himself to save a young boy, Edmund, who has betrayed his friends. This sacrifice and resurrection mirror the central story of Christianity, Jesus Christ's sacrificial death on the cross and his resurrection, which brings hope and redemption to humanity. However, Lewis doesn't preach overtly in the Narnia books. Rather, he invites readers to see the gospel story through the lens of imagination and fantasy. His aim was to communicate Christian truths in a way that was both beautiful and accessible. Lewis also wrote other works of fiction for adults that explore themes of Christian faith, human nature, and morality. The Space Trilogy, also known as the Ransom Trilogy, includes Out of the Silent Planet, 1938, Perelandra, 1943, and That Hideous Strength, 1945. These science fiction novels explore themes of sin, temptation, redemption, and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. The importance of imagination in faith. One of Lewis's key contributions to Christian thought was his belief in the importance of imagination in understanding and experiencing God. For Lewis, imagination was not just a tool for writing stories, but a way of perceiving deeper spiritual truths. He argued that we could often understand something of God's nature or the human condition through art, music, and stories, ways of knowing that transcend mere logical reasoning. In works like The Great Divorce, 1945, a theological fantasy about heaven and hell, and Till We Have Faces, 1956, a retelling of the myth of Psyche and Cupid, Lewis explores the idea that we are often blind to the truth about ourselves, and that it is only through a kind of spiritual awakening, often sparked by suffering or love, that we can see reality as it truly is. These works show how storytelling can be a means of spiritual formation and revelation. The life of a seeker. Lewis's life as a Christian apologist was also shaped by his personal experiences. Though he became a committed Christian, he remained very much a man of questions, doubts, and intellectual exploration. His writings on faith are often filled with a sense of wonder and mystery, acknowledging the limits of human understanding while encouraging believers to seek deeper communion with God. One of the most poignant aspects of his life was his marriage to Joy Davidman, an American poet and writer. Joy was also a Christian convert, and the two developed a deep and transformative relationship. Joy's battle with cancer and her eventual death profoundly affected Lewis, and his reflections on grief are captured in A Grief Observed, 1961. In this deeply personal and raw work, Lewis expresses the intense pain of losing someone he loved deeply, but also his continuing trust in God despite the sorrow. Legacy. Lewis's legacy as a Christian thinker, writer, and apologist has endured for decades. His writings continue to influence both believers and skeptics alike. His ability to engage with deep theological questions in a clear, thoughtful, and relatable manner has made him one of the most respected Christian writers in the world. His work on the nature of faith, suffering, and redemption speaks to anyone grappling with the meaning of life, regardless of their religious background. His books are not just for Christians, but for anyone who is curious about the big questions of life. Through Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, The Chronicles of Narnia, and many other works, C.S. Lewis invites readers to explore Christianity from a perspective that combines the head and the heart, reason and imagination, logic and mystery. Family background, early family life. C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland in 1898 to Albert Lewis and Flora Lewis. His father was a solicitor, lawyer, and his mother was a highly educated woman with a deep interest in literature. Lewis was the older of two sons. His younger brother Warren, Warnie, Lewis would become a close companion throughout his life. Flora Lewis, Lewis's mother, was a key figure in his early life, and her death when Lewis was just 9 years old had a profound impact on him. Her death left a lasting emotional scar, and it was one of the key events that contributed to Lewis's early turn away from Christianity and the loss of his sense of security and comfort. Albert Lewis. Lewis's father became more withdrawn and emotionally distant after his wife's death, and this left young Lewis to be raised by a series of governesses and tutors. As a result, Lewis spent much of his childhood in isolation, focusing heavily on books and imagination. His relationship with his father was strained, and they were not particularly close during his youth. Warnie Lewis. C.S. Lewis's younger brother, Warnie, born in 1905, played a central role in his adult life. The two brothers were very close throughout their lives. They shared an intellectual bond, a love for literature, and a deep mutual support, especially after both of them had lost their mother. Warnie was also a World War I veteran, and like C.S., Lewis experienced significant trauma from the war. As adults, both brothers lived together for many years in a house called the Kilns, a home on the outskirts of Oxford, where Lewis continued to write and lecture. Warnie was often a source of support to C.S. Lewis, though he struggled with alcoholism for much of his life. Their companionship helped counteract the loneliness Lewis often felt. Friendships and social life, the Inklings. one of the most important social groups in C.S. Lewis's life was the Inklings, a literary circle that met regularly in Oxford during the 1930s and 1940s. The group included prominent writers and thinkers, many of whom had a deep Christian faith. Among the most well-known members of the Inklings were J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Tolkien was not only one of Lewis's closest friends, but also a major influence on his spiritual journey. Tolkien, a devout Catholic, played a key role in Lewis's eventual conversion to Christianity. The two men had long conversations about mythology, religion, and literature, and their mutual love for storytelling was a cornerstone of their friendship. Charles Williams. Another key member of the Inklings, Williams was a poet, novelist, and theologian whose works focused on Christian mysticism and the supernatural. Lewis admired Williams's ability to blend the mystical and the real, though he did not always agree with his ideas. A close friend of both Lewis and Tolkien, Barfield was a philosopher and poet whose thoughts on language and the evolution of human consciousness deeply influenced Lewis. The Inklings met informally, often at the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford, known affectionately as the Bird and Baby, where they would read their works in progress, discuss books, theology, philosophy, and share their thoughts on life. The group had a profound impact on Lewis's writing, and their discussions helped shape many of his key works, including the Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis's relationship with women. Though C.S. Lewis never married until later in life, he had several significant relationships with women. One of the most important women in his early life was Joy Davidman, an American writer who became his wife later in life. Joy Davidman was an American poet and writer who had converted to Christianity before meeting Lewis. She had been married to an abusive man and had 2 sons when she first came into contact with Lewis through letters. Over time, Joy and Lewis developed a deep intellectual and emotional connection. Their relationship became more serious when she moved to England with her sons, initially to seek a divorce from her estranged husband. At first, their relationship was one of friendship and intellectual companionship, but it gradually grew into a deep romantic bond. In 1956, Lewis and Joy married, but it was not a conventional romance. Their marriage was, at first, a legal arrangement to help Joy stay in the country, but it soon developed into a passionate and loving relationship. Tragically, Joy was diagnosed with cancer shortly after their marriage, and she passed away in 1960, just a few years after their union. The loss of Joy profoundly affected Lewis. His grief is powerfully documented in A Grief Observed, a raw and heartfelt account of his emotions after her death. The book explores his doubts, his sorrow, and his continuing faith, even in the face of such overwhelming loss. Other relationships. Before meeting Joy, Lewis had relationships with other women, including Mrs. Janie Moore, a friend of his mother's, with whom he lived for many years after his mother's death. Some biographers have speculated that their relationship may have been somewhat more complicated or emotionally entangled than a mere friendship. However, it is clear that Lewis was not romantically involved with her in the same way he was with Joy. Social life in Oxford. Lewis was a prominent figure in the academic and social life of Oxford. He was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College, Oxford, from 1925 to 1954. During this time, he was deeply involved in the intellectual and social life of the university, engaging with students, fellow faculty members, and the wider community of scholars and writers. Despite his public persona as a professor and writer, Lewis was also known for his warmth, humor, and kindness to friends and students alike. He had a reputation for being approachable and willing to engage in deep, thoughtful conversations, whether about literature, philosophy, or faith. His home, the Kilns, was often a gathering place for friends, students, and visitors, where they could discuss ideas over tea or a meal, personal struggles, and isolation. Though Lewis had a number of close friendships and a fulfilling professional life, he also experienced significant isolation and personal struggles, especially earlier in life. His mother's death, his estrangement from his father, and his early turn away from Christianity all contributed to a sense of loneliness that he often struggled with. He never fully overcame this loneliness, and in his later years, he wrestled with the emotional burden of his grief after Joy's death. In some ways, his social life, especially within the Inklings, was a lifeline, providing him with a sense of belonging and purpose. Legacy of relationships. In the end, Lewis's social and family life was a mixture of companionship, intellectual exchange, and profound personal loss. His closest relationships, especially with his brother Warnie, with Joy Davidman, and with his Inklings colleagues, had a deep and lasting influence on both his personal development and his writing. Through these relationships, Lewis grappled with the joys and sorrows of life, faith, and love, and these themes are woven throughout his books. The bonds he formed throughout his life helped shape his worldview and his understanding of God, faith, and the human experience. Though he often lived a somewhat reclusive life by modern standards, his relationships were marked by intellectual depth, emotional intensity, and a shared sense of wonder at the mysteries of life and the divine.